Hello, and I think we are live. Some will scream at me if that's not the case. Welcome to the Huxley Speaker Series 2020. And as you may have deduced, we're online this fall. We'll be streaming from Zoom and YouTube, and the details for all that are on the Huxley Speaker Series. Other than that, we're going to try to make it as similar to normal in-face Huxley Speaker Series as we can. We've got a full lineup of speakers. That's all on the website. It will be 4:30 each Thursday. Again, Zoom as well as YouTube. The Zoom connection gives you the ability to ask questions, and if you're enrolled in the class, you need to be logged into Zoom for the attendance, etc. So that's, but YouTube is also available if you don't have the Zoom connection. And again, we'll get those links posted each week to the Huxley Speaker Series webpage. You're also welcome to check out that webpage if you want to sign up for the weekly announcements for the speaker series. So once the Zoom is running, I'll hand it over to our guest speaker today. And if you have technical questions, you can use the chat for that. There's also the Zoom Q&A box, which is where you can submit questions during or presumably after the talk, and we'll relay those to James. It's a Zoom webinar, not a Zoom meeting, so a lot of the controls you're used to seeing aren't there, but should be just you see James, and again, use the Q&A box if you want to submit a question. Let's see, what else can I tell you? Again, if you're in the class, make sure if you're in the class and on YouTube, you got a problem, so switch over to Zoom if you can, and your assignment will be due on Monday, and check in with me via email if you have any questions, any of that. Lastly, also just to sort of acknowledge that we're new to the world of Zoom and YouTube and captioning and webinars and live streaming. So anyway, if you have feedback, suggestions, please send them to me. My email is stefan@wwu.edu. That email link is also at the Huxley Speaker Series webpage. So I'd love to get any feedback for that or constructive criticism. With that, I would like to introduce today's guest speaker. We are joined by James Miller. James is a new face on the Western campus, having been recently hired as an assistant professor with a joint appointment between Canadian American Studies, Salish Sea Studies, and the Huxley College Department of Environmental Studies. So we're thrilled to have him. He received his PhD in sustainable architecture, University of Oregon. This is his first 4 year on campus, so sort of not on campus, sort of on campus. James's recent research and the design lab that he runs are focused on using indigenous knowledge as part of the building of resilient communities. He's looking at the impacts of climate change on indigenous communities and ways to mitigate that. So please join me in welcoming James Miller. All yours.
All right, thank you, Stefan. I'll attempt to share my screen now. All right, hopefully everyone can see the presentation now. All right, first I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we gather today, at least those of us here in Bellingham or on Western Campus, on the ancestral homelands of the Coast Salish peoples who have lived in the Salish Sea basin throughout the San Juan Islands, the North Cascade watershed from time immemorial. Please join me in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude for our indigenous neighbors, the Lummi Nation and the Nooksack tribe, for their enduring care and protection of our shared lands and waterways. And for those of you not joining us from this region, please acknowledge or invite you to acknowledge the traditional and those whose ancestral homelands you are on. So thank you for joining, especially for those who I have invited, friends and family, students, faculty at Western, and everyone else. So I'm Dr. James Miller, he, him, his. I'm a Hapa Hawaiian, Japanese American, born and raised in the Midwest in South Bend, Indiana, where I grew up in what I would later learn as the Pacific diaspora. Though to my family members who hopefully are listening in, we probably never thought of that growing up and probably don't really think about that today. And I bet that's true for many of those who grow up within multicultural families in the Midwest. And I'd say I didn't really put the pieces together until grad school. And I bring this up now because it plays an important role as I move forward. So educated as most of us are in the Western system that privileges whiteness and heteronormativity, this is how I was trained to see the built environment. I'm a trained architect, licensed architect in Oregon, and been trained in urban studies and urban design. Architecture may be one of the worst offenders among disciplines in this regard of Western privileges and the dominance of whiteness within the discipline. But as I begin to explore more of my Hawaiian culture and engage with oceanic scholars, especially Kehau Nui and Tuhiwa Smith and Apili Haofa, I started to learn more about an indigenous worldview, indigenous paradigms, and began to see two worlds or two paradigms, Western and the non-Western. And for those starting undergraduate studies, for me, this didn't really happen until I was working on my PhD. So it's good if you can start to explore these other paradigms now as opposed to 8 years from now. And I'm starting here because I feel that it helps explain both the position, how I position myself within the field of research and my practice, and it nods to this keen interest in the questions of migration, diaspora, identity, and placemaking. And if you're curious for this image, I'm the youngest on my mom's lap. So being indigenous, you begin to see yourself in this process, a process of unknowing and knowing. I always wondered why stories of my Hawaiian family seem so tragic, always questioning how one loses their lands, and slowly the truth unwinds when you look for it. To think it wasn't by simple misfortune that your great-grandmother lost her homelands, even if that may be how it is written, but rather through colonial tactics of the plantation owners that cut off your water supply and gives you hope. That's referencing kind of the great grab of water rights on the islands of Hawaii in order to control downstream resources and subjugate indigenous population of Kanaka Maoli. But as you understand the unpacking of these colonial layers, I see hope and I see a reason to fight. And this is the gumption we need in finding solutions in the pressing issues of climate change. I see decolonization as a path forward, and not in the metaphorical sense. For those who've read Eve Tuck and Yang's, decolonization is not a metaphor. Many of us have experienced displacement due to economic pressures or natural disasters. It can be jarring, harmful, and transformative. It's a lived experience many identify with, but what we are on the cusp of is one of the largest periods of human migration in certainly modern history. How can we use our personal stories to assist those facing displacement? A quote from Leone Pihama: "Colonization is colonization, whatever new name we may like to give to it. Globalization, free market, neoliberalism, profitability, capitalism, it is all fundamentally about colonization." And we could add to this that climate change is another aspect of the impact of colonization on the globe. As climate resettlement becomes a realization for many people across the world, globalization will exacerbate the loss of cultural identity, further threatening to erase the sovereignty of these nations. Wealthy nations will benefit from the loss of entire cultural groups, absorbing them into their industrial machine. What is needed in reaction to global climate displacement is action. Some of you might be familiar with some of the recent New York Times articles, one in the last week. Here's one: "The Great Climate Migration." Highly suggest you to go check out the article, where it introduces to the big problem where right now about 1% of the world's population lives in, or is 1% of the world's land area is quote unquote inhabitable. Whereas in the next 50 to 100 years, that's going to increase to 19 or more percent. And what this leads us to is the displacement of potentially 1 billion people worldwide. And those who are most affected, as we might gather from what's been the kind of social inequities that have been highlighted within the COVID pandemic, is that it's the marginalized population, the already displaced, the already disenfranchised. And here's the article, recent article asking, well, what happens in the United States as climate migrations take place? Where do people go to find safety? And I won't provide any answers to this necessarily, but it's a way to frame, I think, I want to frame this within a notion of spatial justice. And I'll get into this a little more towards the end of the talk, and thinking about what does placemaking mean within an unjust city? And how do we provide supportive, or how do we provide supports for these displaced populations who will be migrating into these already unjust cities? So spatial justice, as I mentioned, is at the heart of this. And if we are really speaking to spatial justice, we must address decolonization and the return of land to those who hold the rights to the land. Climate change, forced migration adds a complex layer to this conversation, as indigenous populations across the globe are forced to become settlers due to this mass migration, which I'll again approach towards the end. So I propose two central questions within this notion of spatial justice. As the migration of people to urban centers accelerates due to environmental, social, and economic injustice, how do we address spatial justice and create more inclusive cities? How do we ensure that a pluriverse, to borrow from Arturo Escobar, of worldviews share the right to the city, the right to the environment, the right to an economy, the right to social equity, the right to autonomy? I want to paint a picture that demonstrates both the implications of the design of a built environment on our sense of community and cultural practice, as well as the implications larger global systems have on our rights to the city, to land, and to autonomy. Within the settler colonial context of North America, power dynamics of the city have historically created tensions. New arrivals who hold different sets of worldviews, particularly those outside of Eurocentric bounds. Through acts of disenfranchisement, deracination, exclusion, cities have created hostile territory. The next wave of climate migrants will largely consist of populations with land-based ways of knowing, indigenous peoples of the North, of Oceania, of Southeast Asia, of Sub-Saharan Africa, and more. So just think about that within the context of migration, projected migrations within the United States. We think of where will those be migrating from within the US, and where will they be migrating to? So the dark blue being those that'll have net migration positive, the ones in red, magenta, that will be having net migration negative. And then it starts to think this is just internal within the United States. When you add the potential migration of millions coming from across the world, or within the US's own territory and compact relations, it starts to beg the question of how you create equitable and inclusive cities, a problem that we're facing today without many answers at the moment. So in our diasporas or transnational identities, there are fundamental aspects that help us adapt within new places. We build relationships through respect. We find commonalities amongst new communities, and we build relationships between our cultural landscape and the new urban landscape we enter into. We actively work to transform the city in an attempt to make it more inclusive in our way of life. And here's just some examples of projects within various cities that have moved in this direction towards more inclusivity. Taking an example from Oregon with the work of Gerardo Sandoval, to the Thunder Bay Gathering Circle, work of indigenous placemaking architecture. And then in Toronto, being seen as a city of migration and questioning policies of inclusion. So now to introduce you to the center focus of my research, which is the Marshall Islands, their fight against climate change, or fight for climate change adaptation, as well as the new phenomenon of climate change migration and the continuation of settlement within the United States. So for those of you who are not familiar, the Marshall Islands is a small atoll nation in the middle of the Pacific, approximately halfway between Australia and Hawaii. It spans from 5 degrees north of the equator to about 12 degrees. So it's a pretty vast area of ocean that it occupies. It's an array of 32 atolls and islands. And as a low-lying atoll nation, the RMI is receiving the blunt force of climate change and sea level rise. And we've seen this for those of you who have been paying attention in the news. The Marshall Islands has been popping up consistently for the last 5 or more years. But something we might not often know well, though Western being close to UW and work of Professor Barker on the nuclearization of the Marshall Islands, maybe you do know, but Marshall Islands has a pretty complex history as a trust territory of the UN, which was controlled by the US and therefore occupied from 1947 to the end of the 70s and really into the 80s before the Marshall Islands was declared an independent state or independent nation. And with this history of militarization, it brings in commonalities between the US militarization of the Pacific and its impacts on the livelihoods and well-being of those indigenous peoples on the islands that the US began to occupy, including, of course, Hawaii. So landscapes were transformed into the monetization of space and the disregard of place identity, respect, and responsibility to the land, core or fundamental elements of indigenous identity to land. And foreign building typologies of a modernist project of the United States replaced the local vernacular. This is common history shared by many nations across Oceania, as I mentioned. And once again, they receive the blunt end of colonization. And this story also shows the economic push-pull that many communities have been facing across the globe, demonstrating the importance of community and the role of religious organizations within these growing Pacific diasporas in the plight of colonization. And so similar to many nations in the Pacific, the Republic of the Marshall Islands were colonized by Europe, Germany, specifically Germany, Japan, and lastly, and most significantly by the United States. Within the built environment, traditional Marshallese architecture and settlement planning was entirely replaced, or essentially entirely replaced. In construction practices, the Marshallese became reliant on imported materials, technology, and methods, and not unlike other places across the global South, the Western concrete structure is seen as the only safe structure, quote unquote, safe structure to storm typhoon or mitigate sea inundation. The Marshallese built environment was further affected by the impacts of the US nuclear program, most notably the Bravo shot, a 15 megaton atomic bomb that eradicated life on Bikini Atoll. Along with the ancestral homes of an entire population, more recent typhoons further replaced the vernacular architecture of remote atolls with USDA rural housing and disaster relief housing provided by FEMA. It might appear as though the Marshallese identity to place and relationship with land was forever changed through these forces of colonization, but I argue it was not, or at least not at the core of Marshallese culture. Rather, it's easy to forget that influences of colonization are only 200 years deep, and that where we often see assimilation through adaptation, many see cultural or indigenous resurgence through those processes of adaptation. So through extensive work in the Marshall Islands, which is where I conducted my PhD research, not necessarily the focus of this talk, I formed relationships with the communities on Namaruk Atoll, in Laura, which is the largest islet on the capital atoll Madro, which is where the capital is, as well as in Drought and Ulaga, which is in the downtown core of Madro. And that work was really trying to understand what is what I call the deep cultural pattern. I'm not going to go too deep into that, but understanding how ended up being understanding how indigenous knowledge is applied within the production, the culture, what we call the cultural production of the environment, an environment that is culturally supportive and embodies kind of the identity, meaning, and purpose and values within the environment. So in studying the persistence of indigenous knowledge within the marsh leaves creation and adaptation of the built environment through various time periods of colonization, as I mentioned, as well as the current processes of climate change adaptation, I started to realize, or I guess certain specific patterns of knowledge started to emerge, and we compare this to other indigenous peoples and communities, especially from other areas in Oceania as well as even North America, we start to see similarities of importance, like land as providing one's identity, one's resources, this idea of sovereignty, the idea of togetherness, relationality. So here, Ipan Dun, the way of togetherness, the responsibility to one another. The land is a central component to this. In the Marshallese tradition of Zhuang Kijik, it's the idea of one fire, one family, the one fire from which all receive their nourishment, the idea that the labor of the family as a unit provides for all, and the labor of one provides for everyone, to ensure everyone's taken care of. So this idea of reciprocity and responsibility. And then the last here is this idea of Emlap Woj, which was a term that was given to me from one of the elders on Namrik, as he described what the Alap's house was, and what this really describes is what we might more broadly know as multi-generational habitation. And the idea that within multi-generational housing is you also have knowledge dissemination going from elders to the youth. And I'm going to kind of skip ahead here because I'm taking a little time, too much time, kind of introduce this idea of indigenous knowledge applied to the built environment as indigenous design knowledge. So it's knowledge systems born of that respectful and responsible relationship with the environment that's been maintained through time immemorial. So now what I want to do is apply this kind of, I think it's really important to understand this background context and how we might understand how various groups that are being forcibly displaced by climate change, what are important patterns that we can support within placemaking processes in cities, specifically in this case in the United States, but it could also be applied within Europe, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So within this climate migration that we're seeing now, I think it's important to bring up this term Vamoana, which is somewhat established by the Fijian scholar Apeli Hoopa, and further developed, the theory is further developed by Tevita Okeili, who's a Tongan theorist and professor at the BYU campus on Oahu. And it's the idea that islands are not isolated, but rather they're connected through the ocean. And within that space, that's Moana, the ocean, is the relationality between each other. So within space, there's relationships. And that relationship expands as people expand outward, as they migrate. So it's a way of better explaining how Austronesians are not just different, or they're not different ethnicities, but rather coming from the same idea of what spatial relationships are and how it means to have those ideas of reciprocity, responsibility, and respect for one another. And taking it further, it expands it into the diasporas, and it's understanding how diasporas are connected as an expansion of this relationality. And that's an important aspect when we think of especially oceanic migrations into the US and elsewhere, and how this play a role in, I think, better supporting and understanding climate migration. Some argue that migration is a mode of resilience. It shouldn't be seen as a negative. It's only negative within this colonial viewpoint or Western viewpoint. All right. Sorry, getting a little ahead of myself. So a big question for the thousands of communities across the globe is, how will we ensure that cultural continuity of climate migrants is continued? The numbers are staggering, and we know that the current state of our cities and our attitudes will not serve justice to these populations. So what do? There's something we all see we all have the time, sorry. There's something we see all of the time in the study of vernacular architecture and settlement patterns, and that is adaptation. And in general, it's an underlying assumption, I kind of mentioned this earlier, that adaptation demonstrates weakness. The idea that an architecture does, it's the idea that an architecture, if it does not fit, that adaptation is seen as a process to make something fit. Unless, of course, you're wealthy and then you can just call it a retrofit. So again, there's also this kind of socioeconomic framing that gets placed even on what adaptation means. But the way I like to see adaptation is as a resurgence of identity, of culture. And when I'm bringing this image in, because when we think of resettlement and how do you resettle mass populations, if we think about refugee resettlements in Jordan, pictures come to mind. If we think of refugee resettlements in Germany, you might have seen some of these modular units pictured here. But what happens often in North America is the refugees are entering the existing systems of affordable housing within cities. So here's a picture of affordable housing in Toronto that is occupied by 85%, or not 85%, 85% immigrants, and a vast majority of those are refugees. And it starts to change, I think, our perspective, especially as like urban designers, and thinking about how this actually happens and what it looks like. So I think an important part of envisioning a better future is understanding the kind of systems we have to unpack in order to transform them into a direction that will allow. So it's the planning process that will allow for a vision of culturally supportive spaces to take place. So to introduce you to the Marshallese diaspora within the United States, this is dated, it's from 2014, the image of where all of the communities across North America were at the time. And this has grown to an extent today. And then to provide my definition that I'm using within this idea of placemaking within climate migration, that placemaking is a process mediated within the social field, constructed through cultural, social, and political factors. The meaning imbued space by a group of people are reflected by the negotiation between culture and the place-specific social practice. That kind of removes it a bit from the more art and design understanding of placemaking. Within the approach to this research, the methods have been rooted in an indigenous methodology, which stems or can be compared to participatory action research, the idea that community engagement is core and that it's really placing the research within the hands of the participants rather than within the hands of the researcher, and ensuring that they have the agency rather than the researcher, and that the information is not just given, but offered, in the sense that you're not just taking information from a community, but rather that it's being offered and that it's being used with some mutual benefit between the researcher and the community. So this research started just a little over a year ago, looking at or working with communities in Honolulu, Hilo, and Salem, Oregon, as well as other various areas of Oregon and other various areas of Hawaii, but those are the main cities. Started with a series of workshops last summer to understand how does placemaking take shape within these communities, if it does. And this talk would have been a little bit shorter, but I decided to go back and do a lot of analysis that I had been doing over the summer, but try to combine some to provide a little more depth into what's going on within the Marshallese placemaking in the United States. So you might recall one of the patterns I introduced earlier was Ipandun, this idea of togetherness and the responsibility to one another. It is spatial and it's relational. So within kind of community responses, a term that often came up, I mean, it comes up in any conversation really about Marshallese culture, is Enrabwe Jen Lala Rara, and I'm sorry for any of the Marshallese community members that are listening in for my poor pronunciation. This idea that relationships are the bread and butter of Marshallese life. Again, if you think about comparative Indigenous studies, that's a concept we find across Indigenous peoples. So some quotes is that sharing what you have with love. For example, if you have something, give it to others. Skills to teach, sharing your knowledge. We do it here in the USA, sharing a place to stay as another example. Working together as a strong community, even if we are far from home. That is what we should practice while we're away from our homeland. And then another term that fits within this idea of togetherness is commit, or working together, commit to one another. When the community as a whole comes together and helps build the hut of one family member, the whole island benefits as a combined unit. It's a definition provided by participant. It means that we all help one another, that all help one help all. However, within the pandemic, it is getting harder and harder to see people get together for this type of commit due to the physical distancing requirements, though it's still see it being taken place in other communities. And then bringing back this term Zhuang Kijek, one fire, one family, the idea of sharing food within communities and how is that related to an understanding of place. So we still share food and other items with other family members that live next to us or 20 minutes away. We would drop off food if we get, or call them to come and pick it up. And then a couple more quotes, Juan Abat, Juan Baumle, all share the fruits of labor of the family as a unit, all benefit from it. And that's a practice that we see carried onward within communities, often tied to the household as opposed to larger, or the house, I shouldn't say household. The house might be inviting others into for that sharing of food. We see that as a common occurrence across the various communities. And then another term, Jacques Jibola Ao, the idea of give life to others. So provide one of the quotes, recently the community leaders hosted a mask drive where Marshallese family members are given free masks in light of this pandemic. They announced on the community Facebook page that they will be giving out free masks to every family. The picture does not coincide with that one. The picture was a food delivery run by, or helped Living Islands helped organize, which is a Marshallese nonprofit in Portland, Oregon, that I've been very gracious, or very grateful to be working with throughout this work. And then I wanted to bring up another concept of the digital VA, which is an extension again of this idea of relationships within space or built through space. And this is also seen within, especially within COVID times, in the Marshallese communities and their active placemaking, especially during this summer. And it's used, the digital tools is used as an extension of placemaking within a digital space to continue learning about culture, having communications back home, even other concerts and events that take place through Zoom. And then kind of a newer, so this was not in those kind of 6 identified patterns or knowledge forms presented earlier, but that came more through this trying to unpack what it meant, what did placemaking mean within the Marshallese context. And friend Dial Keju, who's actually an urban planner, Marshallese urban planner based in Washington, D.C., he kept going back to this term bedbed-ijan, which is the foundation here, a foundation there, as this way of how you establish, again, your identity in place. And I'm going to kind of just briefly through the next few slides are just looking at some statistics, not super important. This is a study done by the RMI Migration Lab out of UH Manoa, run by Maxine Burkett, just showing general avenues where people are coming from in the Marshall Islands and where they're ending up in the United States. Here's a slide looking at what are kind of the main reasons that people are ending up in the cities that they are living in currently. And what we see is a trend that is kind of expected, because this migration has largely been seen as a labor migration. You know, we might see it as a labor migration, certainly a chain migration, with the core reason for moving being education, jobs, healthcare, then to being with family, and then kind of towards the tail end, those who, sorry. And then I think I'm going to I'll try to expand on this a little bit more. I know I'm running long, but there's this idea of the proximity of Marshallese community to where they live being important. But there's something we see that happens spatially within some of the cities that draws this question of what are challenges or barriers of placemaking processes and cultural continuity to actually take place within cities in the US. So here's an example of Salem, where most of this data was from the US Census, with some layers added from the workshop that we did in Salem. And looking at the kind of dark orange areas here is where the community kind of generally lives. And what we see is it's relatively dispersed across the city, whereas one might expect with this idea of togetherness that there would be clustering. So there's this question, which I don't have an answer to, of why is that happening, and is there a mechanism that might help relieve that if desired? And then going to Springdale, Arkansas, another one of the largest Marshallese community in the United States. Again, we see a bit of dispersion across the city. And one reason I had thought of in Springdale was that, is it possible that those coming from various atolls were living within kind of atoll groups within the city, or within the spatial area of the city? Don't have that a conclusive answer on that, but the idea that families follow within family migrations or within family receiving homes, it does kind of allude to that idea, which jumps to this idea with the multi-generational housing happening within the United States. We see that, I think often from certain points of view, we often see that as an economic necessity, but really being a central component of the culture. And just kind of how does this take place within space? The tradition of having large gatherings and talking story in our homes whenever is important, and trying out our traditional foods whenever and wherever we want is important. And there's another side of this quote where there's barriers that actually hinder that, and I'll kind of bring up just a few of those at the end. And then other examples of this multi-generational housing. This is an example from Ocean View on the island of Hawaii, looking at what does multi-generational housing look in a relatively unregulated area. I'm going to just skip these. And then another important part of multi-generational housing within both Madro, the capital, and within US cities is the idea of the receiving home, where I think roughly 17% of those interviewed brought this up as a part of their kind of housing in their current situation. Sorry, I'm just going to skip towards the end for the sake of time. Oops. So to contextualize placemaking of indigenous arrivals, we also need to consider the problematic context of placemaking of local indigenous, apologies for getting off track here. All right, so this is examples of, more examples of kind of agency within the communities. This is a mural with Marshall Islands Education Initiative in Springdale that helps with helping establish more of an identity in place with the community. Not their core tenant, but certainly part of what they do. I like to bring up this example of Ocean View in the kind of south end of the island of Hawaii, because it brings up this the possibilities, for better or worse, that happen when more autonomy is allowed within a community. And then some of the challenges and barriers within these communities is these issues that come up time and time again. It's respect of privacy and quietness for neighbors and others in the community. So how do, something like a Sound ordinance impact their kind of cultural celebration, or how does the NIMBYism impact immigrant communities? We see those time and time again, as mentioned. There's a lack of advocacy for events and spaces to support the community and culture, and some of that might have to do with the size of the communities, the need for learning centers for cultural learning, language learning, etc. The need to identify and build resources and get the right people to help build that center. The idea, if you build it, they will come. So that idea of building connections within the larger stakeholder groups in a city. And then some barriers that I see, again, this idea of what's causing this dispersion of clustering might be the assumed way settlement would happen is, how is zoning impacting that? If the example, single family zoning, the idea if we reduced or eliminated exclusionary zoning, that it provides more opportunity for like housing clusters to take place for family, both home ownership as well as living in the same space. As I mentioned, bylaws and ordinances, the difficult barriers to reaching private property ownership, where you might have a little more autonomy and that dispersion taking place in the cities. And then kind of one last point I want to bring up again that I introduced with is this idea that to contextualize placemaking of Indigenous arrivals, we also have to consider the problematic context for placemaking of local Indigenous peoples of the receiving communities. One of the sites of the study is the Marshallese community in Oahu, in particular Kalihi, Nuuanu, and Waipahu. And all of these communities experience conflict. This is largely due to the marginal place that Kanaka find themselves in due to settler colonialism. Urban environments are more representative of Western values, colonial pasts, and global identities rather than Indigenous values, which often either exclude or dilute Indigenous identities, weakening connection to place, leading to the loss of agency and integrity. But as depicted earlier, as I'll show, there are a few examples of how this is countered through various kind of INA organizations in Hawaii, and as well as kind of similar land-based organizations in the continental US. That we have to consider the interaction between immigrant Indigenous and local Indigenous, and the context of each place greatly impacts these relationships. So in this example of Kalihi Valley, the historical displacement and erasure of Kanaka from the homelands has led to tensions and conflict between Kanaka and immigrant, especially recent waves of Micronesians. And the unnatural or acultural environment they live in contributes to this phenomenon. So one example, or I guess this is two examples, sorry, of countering this. One is Hola Aina, which we'll hear more from Tuti Baker later in the Huxley series about, but they have a program driven by, or centered in health and nutrition, but also cultural knowledge sharing. And it's open to those who live in Kalihi. So you often have, a mix of Micronesians, Hawaiian, Samoan, Tongan, etc., working on place-based processes and kind of learning and engaging with each other in their Indigenous knowledges. And then another example from, again, Living Islands of Portland, Oregon, working on a canoe project where it also did invite the local tribes within that project as a way of sharing this knowledge of boat building and navigating the waterways. And I'm gonna skip the recommendations because I honestly don't think they were that great. I kind of joked that I wouldn't have any answers to this problem, but I can allow for that in the little bit of question and answers. All right, so I just want to end on one point. Sorry, Seven. So something to consider across time, oceanic peoples, migration has been a tool for resilience. And the large population of Marshallese in Springdale, Arkansas is often known as a new island, an extension of Aleonkine, our islands. Historically, Marshallese would move from atoll to atoll as natural disasters left their islets underwater and crops decimated. While this is not necessarily a shared strategy across coastal communities, northern climates, or sub-Saharan communities, it is likely a future for millions across the globe. For our future generations, it's time to act. Let us learn from the knowledge of those who have protected the lands we work, play, act, and thrive on for millennia. Thank you.
Thank you, James. And we're a little tight on time, but we still got some time for Q&A. If you have to leave, that's fine, but we can run this for a while still and go. And again, as a reminder, if you want to put in a question in there, you can use the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll moderate those and come back. A couple of questions coming in. One from Tate, and I'm going to apologize, and I'm going to try to repronounce the Hawaiian greeting that Tate offered you. But she asks if you've been following anything of the Waimanalo property, Barack Obama's property, and it's the controversial seawall and policy and loopholes and erosion. It's being built on predominantly Native Hawaiian community property. Do you know if you've heard of it? It's off of your topic a little bit, but if you've heard any of that and have any thoughts related.
Yeah, I'm not familiar. Well, mahalo Tate for the welcome and the question. I'm not that familiar with the Barack Obama building, Waimanalo, but certainly aware of many of the issues. Like I know I believe there was a proposal as part of that, the Barack Obama legacy, to have an actual like Kanaka space in Honolulu, and I believe it didn't go far. And I know for some of my friends, like architects and urban designers in Honolulu, that was kind of a big letdown. And I know that, so that's another side of this. There's this contention of, well, you're putting this money in for this, presidential space in Hawaii, but you're not even going to recognize Hawaiians and create, this idea of what is a Kanaka placemaking in Honolulu, something that, I've had discussions with some of the urban planners and various architects in Hawaii with. And then that kind of just carries forward this whole issue with, impacting and eroding the Native Hawaiian community.
There was also a question of checking on a statistic that you put out there. I think you said 1% of land is uninhabitable now, but 19% will be uninhabitable in a certain year. Do you remember off the top of your head what that stat was that someone was asking about?
Yeah, that's us from the New York Times article on the global climate migration, and I believe I even had the 19% wrong. Sorry, I'll have to go back and check, but I think it was 17%, and my assumption is 2100. I'd want to say 2050, but I doubt that's correct because it's the 1.5, 1.5 that 17%.
There's also a question looking at the difference between house and household in this context, and is there a difference in terms of your discussion there and sharing of resources? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think, yeah, a bit of it's the semantics, I suppose, of our vocabulary, but generally there is a difference between house and household, often because when we think of house, especially within a Western context, when you're talking with, a bunch of American scholars or European scholars, house brings up a certain notion, and that's not necessarily, which often is conflated with household, but I would argue is not the same. When we think of a house, especially in like an oceanic, talking with some First Nations friends up in Ontario, they would kind of likely agree, where the house is just a living unit. It's where someone kind of sleeps, but if you're not occupying indoor space all the time, a house is not really a house. So household is just a way of measure of like the family unit, but again, family unit, it could be or not that, it could be a large extended family, I should say.
Right. Within the context of climate forced migration and the corresponding relatively immediate demands of food and shelter and livelihood, how do you balance those against the more subtle needs of cultural preservation and placemaking and the valuing of indigenous knowledge? It seems like you've got kind of two questions looking at two different sort of extremes of demand in terms of response.
Sorry, Seven, I missed the first half of the balance.
Within the context of a climate forced migration, you have relatively immediate demands for food, shelter, livelihood, and the like, which would seem to perhaps take priority over the more subtle needs of cultural preservation, placemaking, the valuing of indigenous knowledge. So you have thoughts on how we try to do both?
I suppose there's the idealistic answer and the practical. I think this is where I find the kind of the complicated discourse between like the Cernias and Massies of the world and the like Glenn Couthards and other indigenous and the Gomans and Daigle, the indigenous scholars versus Western scholars on this point, because the immediate need is okay, you have to meet our immediate needs of food, nourishment and shelter. But what do we define as shelter? That's a problem. Define shelter and what does that mean in any context? And I think maybe this is idealistic in reality, but I think the importance of decolonizing these processes, when we think, especially if we think of this in the realm of like a UN approach to, or UNHCR approach to human resettlement, is that if you in decolonizing the process, you start to value a connection to place. And what does this intricate relationship when land is literally thought of as your mother or your grandmother? It changes your behavior to how you interact with the environment, which changes therefore, how is nourishment coming within that process? How is shelter coming within that process of resettlement? And it has to happen on, it's this idea of decolonizing a settler state. It's happening if it happens on both ends, again, it's idealistic. If it happens on both ends, you mitigate a lot of you could in theory mitigate a lot of those structured problems or systemic problems.
Yeah. Great. We're a little over time. I think we should, let's see. Oh, actually, one more question just came in. You want to take a quick stab at what make you study the Marshall Islands and placemaking specifically?
So the Marshall Islands, so I guess try not to take too long, but I was originally doing work on disaster reconstruction, did my master's thesis on post-disaster reconstruction in Haiti. Was originally going to continue that work, and then I was talking between my advisor, Howard Davis at Oregon, and my Uncle Joe in Honolulu. I was talking with both of them kind of simultaneously obviously in different contexts, about kind of next steps. Climate change obviously being a huge component in what do disasters look like in the future, thinking of climate change as a slow onset disaster. And then my Uncle Joe, who used to have be part of a teaching program between his school in Hawaii and the Marshall Islands, drew my attention to the Marshall Islands. And through some family friends, the Stagies, I kind of started getting to know more about the context and the communities, and it went on from there.
Great. Okay. Thank you for your time. Sorry that we can't give you a rousing room full of applause. And your email there is so people can, it's obviously a conversation that's not going to end quickly. It's going to be ongoing. So we look forward to more. Everyone else, see you next week. Same time and place. Thank you very much and good day.